Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to WRAP's second webinar of 2020. I'm delighted to say we're going to be giving you an overview of our work on consistency. So I'm Claire Shrewsbury, the head of the department that looks after all of this, and presentations will be led by Mike Gardner and Sally Wilson, who are part of our local authority team. So hopefully most of you know who WRAP are. And our mission obviously is to work in a world where resources are used sustainably. We work across a wide range of subjects, food, plastics, textiles. We're just so you're aware, we're just having a little problem moving on the next slide, so we'll sort that out just in a moment. But we've obviously worked in resource management for many years. And this is a sort of culmination of work that that we've been doing. So if you just bear with us for 2 minutes, the slide is not moving on. We'll just put ourselves on mute so we can sort that out. Okay, so we seem to have solved that. So our mission, obviously reinventing, rethinking and redefining how we use resources in the world effectively, but obviously we're quite focused in on England at the moment. So the webinar, it is being recorded and we will share it across the website, WRAP website after we've finished. Please do feel free to make any comments and ask questions via the chat function. What we're hoping is that at the end of the session there'll be time for lots of questions and answers, but if there isn't, we'll give you some instructions on how to send in your questions, because we hope to respond to as many of those as possible, but we may run out of time. So this afternoon what we're going to cover is, I'll just give you a bit of background and some context to consistency. And then Mike and Sally will run you through the collections option modelling, what we did, and then really how we did it and what they've found, and what our next steps will be. So on background and context then, so you may all be aware that WRAP's worked for probably the last sort of around 4 years, has been working with over 100 local authorities across England, helping them to assess their future options for the development of their waste collection and recycling services, with the principle of consistency in household recycling underpinning many of the proposals in the government's resource and waste strategy. This webinar will share some of the key findings from WRAP's consistency support, highlighting different collection scenarios and how they performed in our studies. So the webinar is aimed at officers involved in designing local authority household waste services. So without further ado, sorry, surprise slide. So the principles underpin the key proposals in the resource and waste strategy, and how we've done and what we've done with local authorities. So the proposals in the strategy, the key ones to note really are the requirement to collect a core set of materials. It proposes what those materials will be. Obviously to note is that that includes plastics, pots, tubs and trays. It also, there's a requirement proposal 4 is that there's a requirement for all households to provide separate weekly collection of food waste. And then there's the minimum service standards to provide guidance on separate collection of dry recycling. So over to Mike now to talk you through the different collections options modelling and some of the results.
Okay, thanks, Claire. The resources and waste strategy included a lot of detail about the impact of the government's proposals at a national level. What we've been doing over the last 4 years is we've been helping local authorities across England understand the implications of consistency at the local level, so and what it means for their service. And just to show you who we've been working with, we've worked with about 30 unitary authorities across the country. we've worked with 68 collection authorities and a further 9 WDAs in those two-tier areas. So quite a coverage, a good range of both urban and rural authorities throughout the country. In terms of what it involved, really it meant modelling a range of alternative collection scenarios in line with the framework for greater consistency. And we did that to help officers understand the likely cost and performance of those scenarios. And whilst the exact configuration of the alternative collection scenarios varied from authority to authority depending on their circumstances, and there's no end of different combinations that you can have. Typically, officers wanted us to assess 3 main collection scenarios. So there's a multi-stream collection with food waste, a 2-stream collection of dry recyclables, and a commingled collection of recyclables. And I think that was important because the consistency framework stated what was to be collected, but not how to collect it. And as I said, all 3 scenarios there include the proposed core set of dry recyclables in the strategy, and also a separate weekly food waste collection.
Okay, Mike, can I just ask a quick question? So why is there appears to be a contradiction between our consistency modelling, which includes commingled collections, and the resource and waste strategy, which highlights the need for quality and states several times that paper and glass should be collected separately? And quite simply, are we actually now telling local authorities how to collect?
Okay, well, I think it's important to remember the consistency framework preceded the strategy, because we're going back to 2017 when the consistency framework was launched, and it was clear. It made it very clear that there should be what should be collected, but it was not prescriptive in how those materials should be collected. Since then, I think the resources and waste strategy has kind of further developed that, and there's been a recognition, certainly from the reprocessors, that there's a need to collect paper and glass separately to maintain the quality of that. But I think it's also important to say that the strategy, whilst it's emphasising quality and it's stating that there's a need to separately collect paper and glass, it's not prescribing how those materials are collected. So I don't think there's a big shift. There's a subtle shift there, but it's not a major shift. In saying that, of course, we're still waiting for the detail of that. The strategy is, these are proposals, and they're proposals about principles. So we're really going to be waiting for the consultation later this year, where we find the detail of the minimum service standards. I think everybody's going to be waiting to see what that looks like. But from where we're sitting, there's a subtle change, but it's not being prescriptive on how those materials are collected. So in terms of what we did, we modelled, as I said, those three main collection methodologies, and our modelling process involved a number of stages. The first stage was to collect as much data as possible from the authorities to make it as bespoke as possible. We'd also then do a collection policy review to have a look at the policies that were in place, because sometimes those policies, or more often than not, the lack of them, might dictate how the performance of a service. We then construct a baseline model, which we try and replicate as accurately as possible the services that are on the ground. We then undertake some benchmarking, and then it's the case of looking at the modelling itself to model those future collection options. And then there's the last part of that process is an appraisal and evaluation of results. So all of the studies, all of the support that we provided to those 100 or so local authorities followed this basic framework, this basic process. Right, I've a rather horrible looking diagram here, but we used a model which is called the Curbside Analysis Tool, which CAT, and that was the basis of what we did. And as I said, it does look rather complicated, this, but I think the main point to take from this is that the model allows us to make or rather CAT allows us to model create a model that is as bespoke and accurate as possible. So it really is, it's that old adage about the information that comes out of it is only as good as the information that goes in. So really it was a key bit was always to get as much data as possible. We create that baseline model, which then produces a set of outputs that kind of summarize the key elements of the service that we're looking at. And the reason for that is so that officers can have confidence, I suppose, and recognize that the model accurately reflects their service. So the outputs would be things like the number of households passed per vehicle per day, the number of vehicles required, the number of tips, etc. And that enables officers to say, yeah, that looks like my service, or maybe no, that doesn't. We maybe need to tweak and make some adjustments. The benchmarking that we undertake is done for a couple of reasons. One, it allows officers to really to understand how their service compares with that of their peers. And by peers, I mean their near neighbours, authorities that are not only similar in demographics, but maybe similar in the service that they provide as well. But also it provides an opportunity to inform the assumptions that will be needed for those future collection scenarios. So you can imagine a situation where you're interested in seeing what happens if, for argument's sake, you add food waste to one of those options. You've not collected food waste at the moment. You don't know how much food waste you're likely to collect. So it's useful benchmarking yourself against others to see how much they're collecting, and particularly if they're similar in demographics. So it helps to inform those future assumptions. And then once we've agreed what those assumptions will be, these are then applied to the baseline model, and then that then allows us to construct the future models or the future scenarios. And then, of course, after you've hit the button, it turns out some results, and we look at the results are basically in terms of cost. They're in terms of the resources that are required, and also the recycling rates as well. And this little chart here is just an example of how we would present those results. In this instance here, it's showing how the costs are presented relative to the baseline. In this example, we see that the collection costs are above the baseline, the disposal costs are significantly lower than the baseline, and that the whole system costs, in other words, the collection of disposal costs combined, the net costs, if you like, are less than the baseline. Alternatively, we might present the results of the options relative to one another, and that enables officers to see how they stack up against each other. And those costs will be broken down into the various elements, maybe staffing costs, vehicle costs, disposal costs, etc., to understand how it all fits together. So there's different ways you can present those costs. Right, so that's the process. The interesting bit, of course, is what we found. Right, kind of interesting little chart here. We assessed or analysed the results from 18 different projects. Each of those projects may have contained more than one authority there. And what this chart shows is how it's comparing the costs of those three different collection methodologies. And what we found is that if you look at the first line there, the commingling of food, we found that in 35% of the studies, of the 17 studies that involved a commingled option, the commingled option was the lowest cost option. For a two-stream collection, it was 39% of those 18 different assessments, different studies. 39% of the time it was two streams was the lowest cost. And then at the bottom, multi-stream, we found that in 28% of the studies, the multi-stream option was the lowest cost. So I think it's interesting, this, because I think that goes back to that question earlier about the strategy not being prescriptive about how those materials are collected. Because from what our work has shown is, at the local level, there's no one clear winner. There's no one right answer. It does depend very much on local circumstances.
So Mike, why does the multi-stream option perform less well then, in your opinion, than the other two scenarios, do you think?
Okay, there's a couple of reasons for that. I think the first point I'd make is that the commingled option, there's only 17 data points as opposed to 18 for both two-stream and food. So the commingled, that 35% figure is slightly inflated. But more importantly, I think the multi-stream one, it relies on getting the full value for the materials that you're collecting. That's the whole point of it. You're collecting those materials separately presented so that you're able to maximize the value in resale. However, when you're working with authorities, some authorities have the realities that they face. They have contractual constraints, that their current contracts limit their ability to realize that full value. They may be in an arrangement where they share some of the benefits, but don't get all the benefits. And as a result of that, that then effectively handicapped the multi-stream option. Other authorities, they may not be in that position. They may be in a luckier position, a better position to realize the full value. So that's really a mix. So I think my message there is yes, the multi-stream, we're reflecting the situation on the ground. In an ideal world where you had the full ability to realize the value, I think that figure would have been different.
Okay.
What the chart doesn't show is that in about 40% of the studies, the baseline service was found to be the lowest cost. And given that we know that adding a separate food waste collection will increase costs, and Sally's going to explain that in a lot more detail later on, it was perhaps surprising that we found that the baseline wasn't the lowest cost in the other 60% of options. So the obvious question to ask is why? And the answer to that was that the majority of the studies where the baseline wasn't the lowest cost option, the baseline service had a weekly residual collection. And this graph here kind of shows what happens when future collection scenarios included a change in the residual frequency. So if you look at the red column, that shows that the whole system cost, or the additional whole system cost, when there's no change to the residual collection frequency. And the cost of adding a core set of materials and a weekly food waste, we found to be about £10, £10 a household. But if you're in the fortunate position or able to make some changes to your residual frequency, it changes things quite significantly. And the three examples on the right are where we've worked with an authority and looked at what would happen if they added the core set of materials, collected the core set of materials, added weekly food waste, but reduced the frequency of their residual collection. And that resulted in a change, in a cost reduction, in a net saving to their costs. Not a huge saving, 44 pence a household, £2 a household, 60p a household, but nevertheless it is a saving. So that got a key message there that if in adding the core set of materials and weekly food waste, it's important to view that not in isolation, but as part of the whole system, the whole service. And those authorities making that change produced that saving. This graph looks at the impact on recycling rates from those, and we analysed the impact of collecting that core set of materials plus separate weekly food waste and what impact that would have on recycling rates. Quite interesting results. Kind of mirrors, I guess, what we've seen with the cost as well. There's a difference depending on your residual frequency, but on average, if there's no change to the residual frequency, collecting the core set of materials and a separate weekly food waste can increase your current recycling rate by about 7%. If you make a change, so you collect the core set of materials, you add weekly separate food waste, and you make a change from weekly residual to fortnightly to alternate week collection, that results in an increase of 10%. And likewise, if you go from a fortnightly residual to a 3 weekly and add in your separate weekly food waste and of course set of materials, it's an increase of 11%. So there's quite an interesting result there. Quite a number of things going on there, but some interesting lessons. So in essence, that really kind of sums up what we found in the in analysing the impact of the core set of materials. The impact of separate weekly food waste is the bulk of that increase that you're looking at there. And I'll pass over to my colleague Sally, who's going to explain in a little bit more detail, focusing on that particular element of the work that we've done.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So, yeah, I'm going to look at the key findings and data from the collection options modelling, where local authorities were adding a separate food waste collection. So first of all, we'll look at what happened to the whole system costs when separate food waste collections were added. And it's worth noting in all but 2 of the local authorities involved in the cost modelling exercises, the baseline service did not include a separate weekly food waste collection. So therefore 2 were already had food waste in place. So looking at this chart, this is the costs of adding a separate food waste collection to an existing household waste collection service. So along the bottom, we've got the baseline costs, food waste collection, including treatment, residual disposal savings, and whole system costs. So if we tap through, and you'll see, apologies for one of the bars covering up the text, but you'll see in this example, simply adding a separate food waste collection onto an existing service will typically increase whole system costs, the combined collection and disposal costs, as illustrated by the red bar. For waste collection authorities in 2-tier areas, obviously the impact on collection costs will be even greater unless they receive some kind of the benefits from diverting food waste from the residual stream and get those benefits from the WDA, the Waste Disposal Authority. So additional collection costs can outweigh the disposal savings. So how does this look when we're looking at adding food waste alongside a major service change? So again, on the bottom we have the baseline costs, food waste collection, including treatment, residual savings, collection savings, disposal savings, and the whole system costs. So if a separate food waste collection service was introduced alongside other changes to a service, as Mike's already said, reducing the frequency of residual collections, for example, then the additional collection food waste costs can be offset by the savings from those wider changes. For example, reduced residual treatment costs. And this therefore leads to a net overall whole system cost saving when compared to the baseline. But it's worth noting as well that these numbers in here in the bar charts, you know, they're obviously just used for illustrative purposes, so not the specific costs. Okay. So combined savings can outweigh the additional cost of a separate food waste collection, but of course all this depends on sort of how the food waste is collected. You're probably all aware that there are 3 sort of different types of vehicles that you can use for the collection of food waste, and our collection options modelling looked at those different vehicles. So the dedicated 7.5 tonne collection vehicle, which has sort of 2.5 to 3 tonne payload, are proven to be very effective in collecting food waste. They have much lower running costs than traditional refuse collection vehicles, which obviously helps with your ongoing revenue costs. But of course, along with fuel costs, local authorities obviously need to look at the potential costs associated with increasing their vehicle fleet sizes. So in terms of vehicle numbers, food waste can also be co-collected alongside refuse or dry recyclables in specially designed food waste pods that can be fitted to RCVs or used in split-bodied RCVs. And obviously if you're co-collecting that material, on the same vehicle, that can reduce the total number of vehicles required for collections. But then you've got the associated cost of the payload, which is obviously going to be lower. Sorry, Mike, I've jumped you on too quick. Sorry, apologies. Sorry, so the payload will be slightly different and reduced where you've got the pod vehicle. And of course, when you're looking at co-collecting as well, then you've got to take into consideration where your tipping points are. Obviously, if you're not tipping at the same location as you're tipping the food waste as well as the dry recyclables or the residual waste. So The other alternative vehicle is a resource recovery vehicle, an RRV, and that is where you're co-collecting materials alongside multi-stream dry recyclable materials. Again, this can reduce the number of vehicles required for collections, but RRVs use stillages which only have a capacity of about 1 tonne of food waste before they have to be emptied. So moving on to the next slide, how do those different vehicles perform in terms of costs? So we looked at cost models for 3 different food waste collection vehicle types, and in 47%, so we're looking at the green column to the left, in 47% of the cost models that we analysed, the costs were found to be lowest where the food waste collection vehicle used was a 7.5 tonne vehicle. The co-collection of food waste with either dry recycling in an RRV or using recycling residual in a refuse collection vehicle was found to be the lowest cost in 8 of the models assessed. But of course, it should be noted that not all of the cost modelling included the collection of food waste in an RCV pod. And also, in addition, 3 of the cost models included the collection of food waste using split-bodied RCV. So, of course, I think what it illustrates really is that what vehicle you use will depend entirely on your own local circumstances as a local authority, and that there is no one vehicle type that works out best for every authority. For example, co-collection can work well in rural areas, providing you're tipping the food waste at the same place where you're tipping the other co-collected materials. Dedicated vehicles are relatively low cost and cheaper to run, so in a more urban area, a 7.5 tonne vehicle can work very efficiently because you can have larger round sizes.
So Sally, is this a collection only cost model, or is it a whole model cost?
It can apply to both. I mean, the findings will be the same because your food waste tonnages and the treatment costs associated with what food waste you're collecting will be the same regardless of the vehicle. So, you know, this is looking at either way. It's not influenced by the type of vehicle, but I think what it's showing is how you need to look carefully for your local circumstances when doing any modelling and looking at what vehicle is most appropriate for you. So the next slide looks at, I'm not going to go in this one in detail because there's a summary slide coming up afterwards, and this is looking at adding on separate weekly food waste collections and comparing whole system cost with collection only cost on a per household basis. So the average gross collection cost, excluding any income and disposal costs, was £13 thereabouts per household, and the average whole system net cost, collection and disposal, was £10 or thereabouts where food waste is collected in the 7.5 tonne dedicated vehicle. So, and we calculated that by comparing collection options with and without a separate food waste collection, so that the only thing that was changing was the addition of food waste. So if you look across, the collection only costs show the RRV to be much more expensive, which of course is what you'd expect, but the whole system costs brings the costs much closer together. And unfortunately, whilst we have a lot of data points for the dedicated 7.5 tonne vehicle, we don't have quite so many data points for RRV, and even less for where you've got the pod on the RCV. But we do think that given what we do have and the data that we do have, that the story it tells is that the collection costs between the 3 vehicles are significantly different until you factor in disposal savings and dry recycling income, and then they become more even. So the whole system costs get much closer together. And again, it's just reiterating that what vehicle you choose will come down to your local circumstances. So that's the cost of adding food waste collection. So how about the performance? Again, you know, it's depending on the type of vehicle used, the cost of liners, communicating the scheme to householders. All of those elements are going to increase your costs when adding food waste collection service. But the actual cost will be linked to whether food waste is added to an existing collection service or introduced as part of an overall service change, for example, a reduction in residual waste collection frequency. But the increased performance that you can look at seeing will range between 5 and 10%. And what came from our modelling is being mirrored by what we're actually seeing out there in terms of local authority performance. So you can expect 5 to 10%. The table to the left is looking at what local authorities collect. So there's some examples of some waste collection authorities and unitary authorities, looking at their yield in terms of kilograms per household per week, and then what recycling rate is attributed to that separate weekly food waste collection. And you'll see that it ranges from sort of 6% all the way up to 12% in some areas. So averaging out at about 8%. And then our modelling predicted a recycling rate attributable rather to the food waste, again between 5 to 11% range, giving an average of about 7%. So that's not an insignificant increase in your performance from adding food waste. Unfortunately, what our modelling didn't show us was any clear-cut figures on the different dry recycling performance that you can expect from a multi-stream versus a two-stream versus commingled, for example. There's less specific data that we can give in terms of percentage increases that you're likely to see. However, RAP's analysis over the years has shown that the collection of pots, tubs and trays at curbside tends to be associated with higher recycling rates overall. So indicative yields, the collection options modelling only modelled separate food waste collections. We didn't model mixed garden and food waste collections. And the reason for that is because our analysis has always shown that the capture rates of food waste are significantly less in a mixed collection, even if that mixed collection is weekly. So the amount of food waste, as you can see from the table, is that it's about 1/3 to 1/2 less than that where food waste is collected separately. So the indicative yields then for a separate weekly collection, 1.5 kilograms per household per week. So the next slide is going to look at how local authorities that actually operate separate weekly food waste collections are performing. So the red bars to the left are those that are collecting less than 1 kilogram per household per week. And RAP sort of uses this as a threshold, and we would view a scheme that's performing at less than 1 kilogram as being a sort of a poor performing scheme. And then if you look at the indicative yields that we've had on the previous slide of 1.5 kilograms, there are a significant number of local authorities that are performing at that level and above. It's a wide variety of performance. I think that is, safe to say. And there are 133 local authorities that are collecting food waste now. And the wide variety of performance, some of those reasons you can't change. Your demographics and collections of food waste are going to be more challenging because of the area and your demographic profile, but some of the things can be influenced, and that includes how you design your food waste collection service and the quality of your service delivery. But I think what this chart shows is that there are a lot of authorities now who are collecting really good yields of food waste and are acting as excellent role models, showing that weekly food waste collections can be successfully delivered. So as recent analysis by RAP, and there will be a link to the report that we will share with you, does show that local authorities that have separate weekly food waste collections do have lower overall food waste arisings. And this would suggest that introducing food waste collections does have an impact on householder behaviour and leading to a certain level of food waste reduction. However, the expected drop-off in total food waste arisings after a separate food waste collection is introduced is actually less than 5%. So there isn't that big tonnage drop-off that some local authorities are concerned about seeing once they introduce a separate scheme. And I think it's important that local authorities ensure that their food waste collection service is running efficiently, but that it continues to be communicated effectively to householders. We know that their habits sort of drop off a bit after a while, and it's keeping householders positively engaged in that service so that any tonnage fall can be attributed to a change in behaviour and that it's not because of the food waste being diverted back into the residual waste stream. We also have evidence that introducing a food waste collection has an overall positive effect on increasing the capture rate of other curbside collected materials. So all in all, if you've got a good food waste service running weekly, people are more likely to be engaged in your dry recycling collections as well. So that's my bit done on adding food waste collections and the costs that we saw, the performance that we saw, and the differences between the different collection vehicles. I think the thing we're going to cover off now is really next steps for you as local authorities if you are actually looking at making service changes. So obviously the cost and performance of introducing a service adding a new service, depends on a range of factors, some of which we've covered already. But the information and data we've covered today will be available in a series of case studies. So if people do want a bit more detail, then they will be in the case studies, which we will upload to our website in due course, and we'll let you know when those will be up there. But in addition, there are a number of tools and guidance documents that we already have available on our website that local authorities can use as a starting point if you're starting to look at modelling different collection options and service changes for your authority. So Mike already mentioned about the curbside, the costing tool, the indicative cost and performance tool, and we actually ran a webinar on that last June. Our WRAP website homepage has a link to all of our webinars, so please take a look, and they're all recorded, so you can go back and have a look at that one if you couldn't join at the time. And the curbside costing tool will calculate the indicative costs, collection and disposal of a range of different collection scenarios, including separate weekly food waste collections. So it enables local authority officers to take a high-level assessment of cost and performance of the different collection scenarios when compared to your current baseline service. For a more refined estimate of the likely yield that a separate food waste collection will achieve, we have a ready reckoner formula, which has been generated from WRAP food waste trials. And this sort of identifies a correlation between separate weekly food waste collections, the frequency of your residual waste collections, and the level of deprivation in your area. And this ready reckoner will predict the amount of food waste collected by separate weekly collection with a range of residual collection profiles. So there will be a link to where you can find that on our website as well, and we make sure that you have access to that. And also on our website, there is technical guidance documents and best practice. So we have the Household Food Waste Collections Guide, which has a number of different chapters within it, looking at things like likely capture rate, looking at communicating, looking at issues such as liners and the types of caddies, and all of that's within the Household Food Waste Collections Guide. There's also consistency in collections is on our website. There's a recycling guidelines document, and there's some information about improving quality and cutting contamination. So all of that's on there for you to take a look at, but also we're here as a team to offer one-to-one support for local authorities. So if you would like to discuss in more detail a potential for one-to-one support, which could include collections options modelling, some support specifically on food waste, you can look at recycling, capture rates, for example, or addressing contamination. There's a range of support that we can provide. Then please contact the ELA support team, and that's what we all look like. Yes, we're all looking very happy there. So that's our team. We're here to help. If you need to email us, there's a general email address, which is la.support@wrap.org.uk. And then if you want to email us individually, that's fine. First name, last name, and then @wrap.org.uk. So yes, we're here to help. So I'm going to go back to Claire now.
Yeah, so thanks Mike and Sally. Great overview of all the work that's been going on. So hopefully you all found that really interesting. And as Sally said, a number of those case studies will be live on our website in due course, and we'll make sure that you get links to those when we can. So we've now got, up to about 20 minutes for Q&As for those of you. Thanks for submitting some questions. We've had some of those already. So we've had one, will it be possible to get details of the different options modelled? Mike, is that?
Sally mentioned that we'll be doing some case studies. So our intention is to publish a limited number of the assessments that we've carried out as case studies. But I think they will illustrate the kind of key points, the main points that we've identified today. So I think we'll aim to get those on the website as soon as possible.
Okay, and then we've had another question. A key point of the analysis seems to be the whole system cost perspective, which the person asking the question concurs with. However, on this basis, what recommendations will WRAP be making to DEFRA with respect to updating the financial relationship between waste collection authorities and waste disposal authorities? And they've said, put another way, why are they persisting with a financial framework that is almost 30 years old, never designed for today's complexities and clearly no longer fit for purpose. Are we in a position to make a comment on that?
Oof, I'm assuming that the financial framework that Duncan refers to is a recycling credit scheme. I think that there's a recognition in the strategy that the two-tier payment system, I don't know if I go as far as saying it's not fit for purpose, but needs to be revisited and looked at. It was introduced, as Duncan says, 30 years ago when to offset the savings to landfill when landfill costs were a lot lower, disposal costs were a lot lower. Things have changed significantly. We've modelled whole system costs, which is very important, because clearly adding food waste and other materials such as pots, tubs and trays is going to increase your collection costs. You only benefit from collecting those materials if you incorporate the disposal savings as well. But the key bit and the key challenge, I guess, for those authorities in two-tier areas is how do you equitably share the benefits between the disposal authority and the collection authority. And if we're saying that recycling credits maybe aren't delivering that now, then there's a real challenge for well, not just for DEFRA, I think for everybody to come up with different with alternative arrangements that equitably share those benefits.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that sort of answers partly Duncan's question. Going back to some of the graphs, I think somebody's asked, can we explain the numbers mean? Are the graphs in thousands against the pound? Is the cost in thousands of pounds? So we just flip back to those graphs there. We're just flicking back.
This one here?
As an example. So I think
I wouldn't get too hung up about the numbers there. They're really just to indicate a principle. The baseline costs that are here are just shown to illustrate a principle that, as Sally said, when you combine the addition of food waste with a change to the residual collection frequencies, it can result in a saving.
I think some of the, we've also got a question about, again, about the vehicles, and somebody asking about, do we know which authorities use different types of collection vehicles? I don't have the numbers to hand of which authorities use 7.5 ton buses. I have some figures, but we can certainly provide that answer when we send out the information with to all the people that have signed up for the webinar. I think again, to reiterate that it depends on your local authority circumstances, the types of vehicles that you can use, but we can certainly get together some figures on who uses pods, who uses 7.5 ton vehicles, and we can provide that to all of you.
Another question we've been asked is why did we reduce the frequency of residual collections? We've emphasised that point quite a number of times. I guess the honest answer was that officers asked us to. I think, however, collecting a core set of materials plus food waste means that a significant element of the waste is removed from the residual stream, and that then has allowed authorities to consider making those changes. So arguably, collecting the core set of materials and adding food waste provides you with that opportunity to revisit the rest of your service and perhaps make changes to the residual collections as well.
And in the collections options modelling, somebody's asked about whether we look at not just a reduction in frequency of residual waste collections, but also container sizes. And yes, we will often look in terms of applying sensitivity and further analysis on the differences between sort of 240 residual bin versus 180 versus 140. We don't have enough sort of data points to be able to say that moving residual to fortnightly in a 180, for example, versus a 240 in terms of how much that would further reduce your residual waste arisings, but we do have some information about that. I think, again, that's very much the local decision to be made. So we would do the collection options modelling based on a standard vehicle, bin size, and then down to you at a local level to look at which bin size would be most appropriate for your local authority, and that would have to look at the types of properties you have, the property makeup, and again, the kind of demographics of your households, if you have larger households, smaller households, flats, etc. But we do look at different bin sizes when we look at restricted residual as well, not just changing the frequency of residual collections.
Okay, so here's one that not sure we're going to be able to answer within the next 15 minutes, but somebody's asked, will the expected significant increase in EPR, that's extended producer responsibility fees, i.e. to pay for collections and sorting, not sway the balance to local authorities to collect everything? I mean, maybe that's one I might start with. Obviously, producers of packaging and sellers of packaging there's a consultation that's been around on EPR and how that might work. And the expectation is that they will be paying significantly higher costs of to cover their the fact that they put packaging onto the market. Obviously, how that is going to be distributed is still being considered and various different models being looked at. But I think it'd probably be fair to say that producers, if they're spending 10 times the amount on compliance, they are going to be expecting certain aspects and materials to be collected for that increased cost. So I think it's true to say at the moment we don't know quite what the format of that funding mechanism is going to be, but it might be that, in form of the part of the minimum service standards, that you need to tick some of those boxes so that you can access the full amount of EPR as you possibly can. But obviously, until we see the next round of consultation, we can't say exactly. So hopefully that, I think it's important for you all to try and stay engaged as possible. And it's our intention that once we know a bit more about the next round of consultations, we will be doing some more engagement with you as an audience, so that you understand the concepts of both what's in the consistency consultation, but also the impacts of what EPR might throw. And the other slight curveball is thinking about what might happen with deposit return schemes and how they may influence the collection costs and disposal costs, either net or not.
Indeed, yeah, there's a huge amount of uncertainties. I think looking at the work that we've done and the points that we've pulled out today, I'm kind of minded that there's a number of similarities between the consultation that the government's sent out, because effectively it was about consulting on a set of principles rather than the detail, as you've said there, Claire. And I think what we've managed to pull out today from our analysis of the modelling work that we've done for authorities, again, is a set of principles. And amongst those principles is that there's no right way of doing it, that you really do have to look at your own particular circumstances. There are some trends, interestingly. The separate vehicle for food waste collections, I think that's quite an interesting one, the one that comes out as being the lowest cost. But at the end of the day, these are, it's not an exact science, they're not absolutes, they are principles that have kind of emerged.
Okay. Somebody else has asked, why is card modelled as being collected with glass rather than paper? And that was back on maybe on the consistency slide that we had. Was that part of the modelling, or was that part of?
For the two-stream models, I won't flick all the way back through all the slides, but for the two-stream models, we looked at two different alternatives: either paper and card collected together and glass separately, or the paper and card added in with the other dry recyclables and glass collected separately, or paper and card collected separately and the glass added in with the other materials. And we still find that when we're working with authorities, they like to look at both, because again, we still are waiting for the details from the minimum service standards, but all that we've had from DEFRA in the consultation was that paper and glass should be collected separately, not together. They haven't said which of those materials should be collected on their own. So you can do it either way, and there's pros and cons, and I guess there's pros and cons to both.
Okay. Somebody's asked a really useful question. Will we share the recording? And yes, we'll make that available via our website and send a link out to everybody. I suppose, Michael, Sally, do you want to talk about what our plans might be for next year? What's on offer for local authorities? What can they expect from the team in the next financial year?
I think we're going to still provide one-to-one support. I know. And we're already sort of looking at local authorities that we have worked with before, who may be looking at actually rolling out services and making service change on the ground, and we can offer some support in that on that side of things, for example, procurement, and looking at contractual changes. Local authorities that are just started to think about it, we can offer one-to-one support for that as well. So it'd be similar to what we've done over the last couple of years in terms of the support we can provide to local authorities, and it'll be one-to-one, but we'll also have things like the webinars looking at specific topics. We'll also be looking at perhaps workshops if there are subject areas that local authorities are really keen to look at. One of the things that was just mentioned about keeping glass separate versus paper separate. Obviously some local authorities already have glass separate, but there are health and safety issues being raised around noise, and then with the paper separate there are issues with paper getting wet. So that's the particular topic that we're aware of that is maybe something that we can look at covering off either through a webinar or a workshop. But the one-to-one support and the one-to-many kind of support that we offer, putting as much guidance documents and best practice onto our website, is something that we will continue to do over the coming year. But we always welcome local authorities to feed back to us. If there are specific areas where they would like more information, we can also come to you as a group of authorities, for example, and perhaps look at doing a session on a particular subject area if we have the information to impart.
And another interesting angle, and one that authorities are increasingly asking us about, is the issue of carbon. Authorities of length and breadth of the country are declaring climate emergencies, and then I guess the challenge is trying to articulate what that means and how to respond. And so we've been discussing with how internally how can we assist local authorities address that. DEFRA has produced, or is in the process of producing, a new carbon metric to try and produce some factors which will put some figures on the various different technologies, and we'd like to link that with different collection systems. Again, from the outside, perhaps to the layman, with all these additional trucks going on the road, you might think, oh my goodness me, what impact is that going to have on the amount of carbon dioxide that's being emitted? And I think the challenge then for us and for authorities is to quantify that. So I think that'll be a key part of our work, and quite an interesting part of our work as well this year.
Okay, so we've got another question here. What level of sensitivity analysis has been carried out to determine the impact of fluctuating material prices on the 3 dry options? Is that taken into account?
Invariably, when we do the options modelling, and if you recall, when we were talking about the multi-stream option, and you asked us about why the multi-stream fared so badly, or looked as if it fared badly, one of the things you can do is you can say, well, what happens if the prices fluctuate? What impact's that going to have on the various options? But I think it's always important to recognise that if there's going to be a fall, say there's a fall, we all know there's a fall in the price of paper at the moment. It's not just multi-stream collections that are going to be hit by that. It's all collections, all different processors will be hit by that. And arguably, even those that are collecting paper in a commingled, arguably will be hit even harder, because that material is of lesser quality, because it's coming into contact with other materials in the waste stream. So sensitivity analysis is always a feature of the modelling that we do.
Okay, so got a question here about flats. So somebody's commented that I'm assuming that this is been done for curbside collections only, has any consideration been given to modelling how the different collection options perform at purpose-built flats, given the increasing number of those being built in larger urban areas, as local authorities struggle to meet new housing needs? And I suppose that leads us really nicely on our next webinar is on the 26th of February, and we're doing that alongside Resource London, where we'll be introducing the key learnings from an in-depth research into how people manage their waste in flats. And this webinar will explore how those learnings can be used by other local authorities, and we'll share the information on the barriers and the opportunities that shape the intervention phase of those flats projects. So that's going to be on the 26th of Feb. But Michael, Sally, in particular about the modelling, did that look at?
It wasn't always curbside collections. Flats were included depending on which authority it was. So some of them were large urban authorities where we would have to look at potentially modelling a two-tier kind of system. So one for curbside fronted properties and one for those in flats, and whether that's purpose-built flats, high-rise, or houses in multiple occupation, for example. So it hasn't always just been on curbside collections, curbside fronted properties. We have also looked at flats as well. So there is that in some of the modelling, and that will come through in some of the case studies as we put them onto the website. Mike, do you have?
Well, it's worth noting that the curbside analysis tool that we talked about earlier, CAT, as it says on the tin, is for curbside properties. So we have to use a different model, a different way of calculating what the resource requirements would be for flats. So it is, when we do it, it's done in a different way.
Okay, well, I think that's probably about all the questions we've got time for. So thank you to everybody that submitted questions. If we haven't got round to answering those, we will do, and we'll send those questions and answers back out to everybody when we send the link to the webinar. If after the end of this session you've got any further questions, as Sally said, either just direct those directly to the la.support@wrap.org.uk, or if you think Sally or Mike or any of the other team members might be able to answer your question, the formula of how to email us is up there too. Another plug for the 26th of Feb and the Flats project. That was launched, the report was launched a couple of weeks ago, and some interesting findings from that can be had. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you at the next one.